Welcome to Curiously Kaitlyn, where we try to make theology make sense. Each week, we will hear a kid question about God, theology, or the Bible, and find a scholar who can answer it.
I don't know. That doesn't make any sense.
Curiously Kaitlyn.
Justin Brierley, thank you so much for joining me today.
Oh, it's an absolute delight to be with you, Kaitlyn. Thanks for the invitation.
This is Justin Brierley. He is a writer, speaker, and podcaster who fosters conversations between Christians and non-Christians about faith. He is the co-host of the Re-Enchanting podcast, the host of the Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God podcast, as well as the author of the books Unbelievable and The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God. Absolutely. So let's hear our really big kid question for today.
How do we know God is real?
I just think it's so important to hear that little voice saying, how do we know
Absolutely.
God is real? So, Justin, what is just your initial reaction to this question?
I just think it's a great question and a question everyone asks at some point in their life. I just had a conversation with a child probably of a similar age at church last Sunday, asking a very similar thing. Basically, if God created the universe, who created God, and that's not a quote unquote childish question. Actually, there's lots of adults who ask exactly the same question. So wonderful question. And actually one that, let's be honest, probably a lot of adults haven't really figured out necessarily either. But yeah, I'd love to have a stab at trying to answer it today.
Yeah, I love how many of these kid questions we've had, people have said the same thing. They've said, well, adults are asking these questions. These aren't silly questions. These are really important questions. Kids are just not afraid to be honest about the fact that they have the question. And I love that you were asked this in church. That's where we should be asking the question. So what is just your kind of basic answer? Like if you did only have a minute to start, we'll get into some details in a minute, but if you did have with an adult in church, maybe not just this kid, maybe even I like to imagine this kid asks this question in church and a few adults lean in like, okay, what are we going to hear from you? How do we know God is real?
Yeah. Well, I think it's really important, actually, the way the question is phrased. How do I know, or how do you know that God is real? Because that's not quite the same thing as how do I prove to someone else that God is real? If it's a personal question, that you can know things in a personal way that are difficult potentially to actually prove to someone else outside of you. So I can know that I love my wife, but I can't necessarily, obviously prove that to other people around me. And I would say the first way in which we can know that God is real is that actually many people just experience a knowing, a kind of a way of understanding that God is real. This was my experience when I, was about 15 years old. I'd been going to church and grown up in a Christian environment, but really God became real for me through an experience, through a very personal experience where I just felt like suddenly something had flipped in my mind. And I was like, okay, this is real. I want to pray to God. I want to read my Bible. But that was very difficult for me to sort of explain to my school friends at the time, when I kind of came back to school, a bit of a changed personality. They were like, well, you've had an interesting experience, Justin, So that's the big difference for me, is that it's one thing maybe to kind of know something, which we can know things in all kinds of different ways. Okay. It's a slightly different thing to try and show that is true to someone else who maybe hasn't had your experience. But the first thing I just want to do is to say it's possible to know something without necessarily having to be able to prove it to someone else. And that might be a good place to start.
Yeah. Oh, that's wonderful. That matches a lot of my experience. And I'm wondering if this kid is a little younger than I was when I was thinking through this question really seriously, but they're maybe at the beginning of a journey of going, okay, I've grown up in an environment where I'm at church and my parents believe in God and it's sort of a normal thing. And then at some point I encounter other people and I realize, it's actually really a strange thing to believe in God. And now I'm asking, how do I know that I can be kind of certain about this? Like, I think part of the angst under the question is, I might, on some level, as you've described, there's different ways of knowing things. I might sort of know this, but other people's opinions about this make me feel like I need a firmer foundation for this. How would you respond to the kid who's like, okay, maybe I can say I know this, but like it does matter to me to show people or to have some explanation to people?
And which is exactly the scenario I had a year or two ago when my 8-year-old son came to me having sort of, I guess always, in his life imbibed a natural belief, if you like, in God, but had evidently, had some kids at school saying, well, is it really true? Or is God a bit like the tooth fairy or something like that? And so Nat came to me and said, but Dad, okay, I believe that God exists, but how can I show that, or to other people and so on? And I think there are some really helpful ways of thinking about God that help to show other people that it makes sense to believe in God. These are not sort of mathematical proofs or knockdown arguments for God, but they are at least things that help us to see that it kind of makes sense.
Justin is showing us here one approach to giving a rational defense of the existence of God. There are lots of different approaches Christians have relied on throughout history, including some that do attempt to give mathematical proofs for the existence of God.
And the way I've often done this, because I've hosted conversations for years between Christians and atheists, what I've realized in the course of hosting those is that we all come to life with a worldview of some kind. Okay, this idea that there's a sort of interpretive lens through which we look at reality. And if I'm a Christian, then I have this view that there is a God, that there's a kind of a meaning, a purpose behind the universe that's created me for a particular purpose. But if, when I talk to an atheist friend, they're looking at it from a different lens. They're saying, well, actually, I don't believe there's any ultimate purpose. I think that ultimately everything can be explained by natural laws and physical processes and purely material things. Okay. And the question is, whose worldview makes best sense of the evidence that's actually available to all of us? It's not that I've got some absolutely iron-cast proof for God, but it might just be that my way of looking at the world fits with more data, fits with more bits of evidence than my atheist friends. Now, my atheist friend probably does have some things that seem to stack up in their favor, like the problem of suffering and evil is a common objection against God, and got to take that very seriously. But actually, I think there's a lot of other things that stack up quite well in favor of the idea that there is a mind behind the universe, that there is something more than just matter in motion, if you like. And so if I've got time, I'll just give you very briefly three things that I think kind of fit better with the Christian view of reality than, say, an atheist view of reality. The first would be that I think human existence makes better sense if there's a God than if there's not a God. The fact that we're here, to actually think about the fact that we exist and look at the universe that we exist in, even our best science seems to be pointing towards the idea that there's some kind of purpose behind the universe, because when you look at what it took for humans to exist, the incredible, what's often called fine-tuning of the universe for life is an extraordinary phenomenon. This idea that the initial sort of numbers that the universe was set up with had to be so precisely dialed to exactly the right degree in order for chemistry and gravity and electrons and galaxies and stars, all the things that were needed to kind of eventually allow life to exist in the universe. All of that had to be so incredibly precisely dialed. It's very hard to see how that was just an accident, just pure chance, if you like. Then you've got the fact there is a universe. Again, science seems to be pointing in the direction of there being a kind of a beginning to everything. That raises huge questions. And there's the fact we can do science at all, that the universe is written in the language of mathematics. Is that just a crazy fluke, a huge coincidence? It was something that the Nobel Prize winning physicist Eugene Wigner called a miracle, the fact that we can do science itself. So all of these, if you like, are clues to me that we're not here by chance, that the purely material atheist view of reality doesn't seem to stack up very well with actually what we see. And it kind of fits better with, what we do find in scripture and in the Christian tradition, which is that God created, that there's a cause, if you like, behind it all, and specifically of you and me. So I think God makes best sense of human existence. That's one thing I might want to have a conversation with my friend who's questioning the existence of God about. But secondly, I think God also makes sense of human value. So not just the fact we're here in the universe, but if we look within ourselves and ask, well, why do we believe in things like human rights and the equal value and dignity of every human being, no matter what their gender, age, status is? Where do we get that idea from? Again, it's very hard for me to find a an explanation for that on a purely material, naturalistic worldview. But if it's true, as the Bible says, that we're made in the image of God, well, that gives every human being, regardless of their background and status and age and ethnicity, a kind of an infinite value. And for me, again, if you're someone who believes in the idea of right and wrong, that there are some better and worse ways to treat human beings, I think it's very difficult to come up with an explanation of that on a purely atheistic worldview. It kind of makes sense on a Christian worldview that we've got this sort of idea. Okay. So human existence, human value, and then the third one for me is human purpose. And it's this sense that most people have some kind of a sense in their life that life is about something, that there's some kind of meaning behind things, that our lives are meant to be for some kind of purpose. And you find this across every time and place and culture, across time and across the world. And it would be very strange if that was purely an illusion, something kind of foisted upon us by a purely naturalistic sort of process that gave us an illusion of us being here for a reason. And the fact that so many people spend pretty much their whole life looking for that reason. And I love the way C.S. Lewis put it this way. He said, he called it the argument from desire. And he said, a duckling wants to swim. Well, there is such a thing as water. A baby feels hunger. Well, there is such a thing as food. He said, if I feel in myself a desire which no other thing in this world can satisfy, the only answer is that I was made for another world. And I think that's true. It's not a strictly logical argument, but there is this sense that actually, yeah, if there is this common human search for the transcendent, could it be that it actually has an answer, that something could meet it? And of course, I believe as a Christian that it has been met very specifically in the person of Jesus Christ. That when in his life and his death and his resurrection, he kind of demonstrated all the things that we do need to live a meaningful life. If you're looking for love, then his sacrifice on the cross was the most extraordinary demonstration of that that's ever been given. And if you're looking for hope, then his resurrection is the thing that has kind of given hope to billions of people down the ages. And for me, is a very powerful argument, actually, that there's something about this that makes sense. And it makes sense of that human search for purpose. So the three things, human existence, human value, and human purpose, for me, all fit better with the idea that there is a God behind it all.
And now a word from our sponsor. Wait, what's a sponsor?
This show is sponsored by BetterHelp. We all need help processing emotions, dealing with challenging situations, or working through conflict. But sometimes we need professional help. I've had a few times in my life where I saw a professional therapist to help process anxiety, work through pain in the church, or just get an emotional checkup. If you're thinking of starting therapy, BetterHelp can be a great place to start. It's entirely online, designed to be convenient, flexible, and suited to your schedule. Just fill out a brief questionnaire to get matched with a licensed therapist, and you can switch therapists anytime for no additional charge. Stop comparing and start focusing with BetterHelp. Visit betterhelp.com/curiously today to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/curiously. If you're anything like me, stress and exhaustion can get in the way of living your life more fully. Spending time with friends, reading more books, running around with kids. Well, it turns out that 75% of American adults are deficient in magnesium, a mineral that's essential to hundreds of functions in the body. Mellow Magnesium from Ned is a powerful daily super blend that contains the 3 most bioavailable and nutrient-dense forms of chelated magnesium on Earth, the 2 most stress-busting aminos, and over 70 trace minerals. Mellow offers 300+ health benefits for better sleep and optimal health. And it comes in 4 really delicious flavors. There's lemon, lavender berry, pomegranate, and naked, which is a stripped-down, flavor-free version that's great for adding to your smoothies or protein shakes. Ned shares all of its third-party lab reports, and its products have over 5,000 5-star reviews. Become the best version of yourself and get 15% off Ned products with code CURIOUSLY. Go to helloned.com/curiously or enter code CURIOUSLY at checkout. That's HELLONED.com/curiously to get 15% off.
That is so helpful. And a lot of your work has given me some language to talk about the experience that I have had, taking classes at Duke with people who largely did not grow up in the church or are quite antagonistic to Christianity or to the church. And yet in conversations, I think about this gender studies class that I took. In conversations with folks in that class, it would become so clear both that there was a desire, as you've just described, for a certain idea of the value of human people and of purpose and of meaning in the universe. And there were even moments when it was so clear to me, like, oh, you are operating on some level on some Christian ideas, even though you would say you want nothing to do with Christianity and you're very opposed to it. There's a point in the conversation where you have to stop and just say, like, I don't know where I'm getting this from, but I believe this, and this is important. Will you talk a little bit about, for the adults who are mostly listening, what it means for us to live in a world that has been so shaped by these Christian ideas you're talking about? And if there is room then, as we're having these conversations with other people, how do I know God is real? How do I express that to other people? Are there resources for us because we live in a world that has been so shaped by those Christian ideas?
It's really interesting, this point you bring up, Kaitlyn, because actually, the argument I was just making that we sense that there's this idea of human value, and that kind of can only really make sense if there's a God who gives us that sense of value. That's kind of a philosophical argument at core. The question is, I suppose, that you're asking is, well, how did we arrive at this point where we do believe in human value, human rights, and freedom and progress and compassion and so on? And that, in a sense, there's a historical argument, quite simply, for that. And I think it's been very compellingly shown by historians like Tom Holland in his book Dominion, that actually the Christian Revolution is very specifically what made you and me, as modern 21st century Western people, believe in human rights, compassion, progress, and everything else.
Justin is going to refer a few times to modern Western 21st century people. These words are important, and they don't necessarily mean what we might think they mean on the surface. In this context, modern refers to the modern period, the philosophical and cultural period that began around the 1500s and continues today. It's defined by significant scientific and technological changes, as well as political changes. As Justin mentions, more democratic and egalitarian ideas began to dominate, even if they were definitely not universally applied. The word Western here refers to a collection of human societies in Europe, North America, and Australia and surrounding areas that share a similar political and cultural heritage. Both of these words are kind of squishy. Their definitions aren't perfect, but they're helpful to very generally describe a distinct period and place. Together, these words modern and Western are often used to describe the cultural context that most of us live in now. The important thing here is that Justin is describing how the values that shape most of our lives are not necessarily the values that other people in other nations hold, and they're not the values humans have always held throughout history.
Because when you go and look at the ancient world, which, is where Tom Holland began his studies, the Greeks and the Romans, these were not universal givens by any stretch. And indeed, today, in many parts of the world, they are not a given. So very often the assumption is, when you are talking to other modern 21st century Western people, oh, well, we all believe in human value now. There's nothing particularly unusual about that. Well, actually, there is. It's quite unusual. We live in a very curious moment in the history of culture where these are kind of givens, in our social circles. And I think what is helpful to point out to people is that this is very much comes from a very specific change that happened 2,000 years ago, when Christians started to point towards Jesus as an example of what true humanity looks like. This idea that it is about sacrifice and self-giving love, and about lifting up the broken and the vulnerable. And that was why Christianity really became so popular among women and slaves and children, especially. We've sort of, because, as you say, we've been so shaped now by that Christian story, even as we started to forget the Christian story or stop going to church in the West, the values have just sort of carried on under their own steam, if you like. And so people sort of forget just how much we owe them to actually the Christian story. I think what's happening, though, is as the Christian story does start to diminish increasingly in parts of the West, people are starting to suddenly realize, oh, hang on, there are other worldviews out there. You know, you have got Putin in Russia. You have got very fundamentalist forms of Islam in other parts of the world. You've got communist China. Not everyone shares these ideals. And then the question is, well, can we hold on to them without the Christian story that actually undergirds them? And I think people are realizing, no, it's going to be quite difficult to do that. So I think the place I would want to sort of start with the conversation with someone is just to sort of help them to recognize that these values are not universal and commonsensical. They are absolutely a product of a very specific Christian environment. And then there's an interesting conversation to be had about how do you, if you do value these things, how do we hold on to them in the absence of that Christian story? I've met some people who just kind of want to kind of build up a sort of quote unquote Christian culture again, but they're not that interested in the Jesus who stands behind it. And I think that's a bit of a dead end, personally, because I think the only reason you've got the Western values that you appreciate is because people actually believed in the Jesus to which this all goes back. So I feel you've got to start with actually the real faith of Christianity to understand what drove people to create, you know, the institutions of healthcare and education and law and everything else that flowed out of that Christian revolution. And that's kind of been my project with something called the surprising rebirth of belief in God just lately.
Yeah, thank you for that. I appreciate it, because I was thinking as you were describing these features of a kind of Christian way of viewing the world, that there might be people thinking like, is that a Christian? I think that that's just how people view things. Like, why does that necessarily have to, you know, provide some kind of evidence for, okay, this is a better way of viewing this. This explains more of how we view the world. They might be thinking that's just how all people have always thought, or that's how most of my neighbors think, but it is distinct and specific and comes from a certain place. Something else I was thinking while you were answering, Justin, was when I was a teenager kind of wrestling with this question for the first time, I went to a lot of apologetics books. I read a lot of arguments that were more along the lines of what you were describing earlier, of kind of a mathematical proof format. And it was interesting because I would read one and be really convinced by it and kind of get the emotional high of like, oh, yes, okay, this is something I can stand on, and this is something firm. And it would only take like a couple of days before mostly the problem of evil or other kinds of more, yes, intellectual, but also in some level emotional questions to cloud that sense of certainty that I had had. And I'm curious if you would, I'm thinking for parents who are listening or for youth leaders that are listening, are there ways that we might respond to this question that would actually be unhelpful? Are there answers we might give to how do we know God is real that maybe give some like temporary relief, but are not very helpful, or might set us up for problems in the future?
Yeah, I think it's really important to always caveat any of these arguments as what they are. They're arguments. They're not proofs. They are, you know, and I don't want anyone to build their faith on whether or not the Kalam cosmological argument is, you know, philosophically valid or something.
In case you're wondering, the Kalam cosmological argument, very fun name, is an argument for the existence of God. It can get pretty complicated, but at its most basic level, this argument says that everything that exists needs a cause, something that causes it to exist. And the universe at some point began to exist, so it needs a cause. Therefore, there must be a creator.
Because then we're obviously building our faith on the wrong thing. All I think where we can use quote unquote Christian apologetics helpfully is just to say, look, actually, there are good intellectual reasons for being a Christian. Okay, you don't have to throw your brain in the trash can to be a Christian, but let's not pretend that this is somehow the way that faith operates overall. It's a kind of, I think, for me, what's the way I've often put it is that Christian apologetics, I think, really the way it functions is a way of removing intellectual roadblocks for people, rather than it kind of creating a foundation for their faith. That's not what it's for.
Yeah.
Because it won't be a secure foundation. What it is that you imagine that you're on a road, and I may have stolen this analogy from Tim Keller, I can't quite remember, but that you imagine you're standing at the end of the road, and at the end of the road is Jesus. And the way that apologetics often functions for people is that there may be some roadblocks standing in the way. Can I trust the Bible? Well, look, here's an argument that may help you to answer that. roadblock removed. What about the problem of suffering? Well, here's a way of maybe thinking about it. Maybe you remove that roadblock. What about science versus faith debate? Okay, let's have a look at that. So you remove some roadblocks, and that kind of clears the way for you to walk down the road to Jesus. But you still have to want to walk down the road. The arguments themselves aren't going to make you want necessarily what's on offer. So it's always going to still be a matter of the heart as much as the head. And so I don't think anyone should be using apologetics in that sense to kind of try and build someone's sort of faith from scratch. What they need to be offering is a vision of Jesus that is so compelling that you would want the thing that's on offer in the first place. And then apologetics may come in to help kind of remove to help with some of those intellectual questions that inevitably a lot of people do face. Not everyone faces. I know people for whom they can completely ignore apologetics because it just doesn't seem to be their thing. They just don't seem to be bothered by those questions. But there's a significant subsection, I imagine you're one of them, for whom it has been kind of important to at least be able to think through those issues. So that would be my advice. Treat it in that way rather than as a way of kind of underscoring faith itself. And it's about helping to remove some of the issues that stop people walking down the road.
Yeah, that's so helpful. Before we get to our last question that we always ask, I'm curious, Justin, if you think, again, there are lots of people listening for whom this is a really personal question, but they're also thinking about their own kids. They're thinking about the kids in their church. They're thinking about their friends and their family members. And I'm wondering if you think anything has changed in the last, 10, 20, 50 years in how we might kind of instinctively respond to someone asking this. If it is a kid asking a parent, how do we know God is real? Are there things that have changed in the kind of cultural milieu that we live in where you might want to offer a different answer along the lines of what you were just saying? I think maybe some people grew up in a context where they had a certain set of answers at the ready for this. And I'm curious, not to ask too leading of a question, but I'm looking around at like Duke undergrad students who are, have crystals in their dorm rooms and are reading their horoscopes and I just wonder if there's anything you might advise people when it comes to the very kind of different spiritual religious context that we're living in, how someone might answer this question.
Yeah. And again, this is something I've picked up on a fair bit in my book and podcast series, which is that I do think the questions change and the background kind of culture it changes. So I very much started my journey in apologetics at a time when the new atheists were just getting up ahead of steam.
When Justin talks about the new atheists, he's talking about a group of thinkers who moved beyond expressing arguments about the existence of God and instead took a more hostile posture, arguing that religion was bad for human societies and should not be tolerated. This group included writers like Richard Dawkins and Christopher Hitchens.
And you had all these best-selling anti-God books coming out, and that was kind of where the cultural conversation was. So it was kind of appropriate at the time to be addressing those objections, and they were very often the same objections that a lot of undergraduates and students had who were reading that material. And so we were, getting into the weeds of the philosophical arguments for God and the problem of suffering and those kinds of issues. I think today the questions have changed, though, as you hint, and I think a lot of to some extent, because that new atheist era has waned significantly, I would say, it's just simply not so high in many people's minds. And primarily when I'm engaging today with undergraduates and students, they tend to be more existential questions that are being asked. It's not, people aren't waking up in the morning asking for 5 philosophical proofs for God. They're saying, give me a reason to get out of bed in the morning because I'm feeling depressed. I'm anxious. I'm not quite sure what my life is about. I don't seem to have any direction. And that, again, is where I'm seeing an interesting kind of conversation happening in the culture as people are kind of, I think very often are now looking at Christianity, not purely from a kind of is it true lens, but and is it useful lens? Is it sort of, would it make a difference to my life if I became a Christian? Now, that doesn't mean the question of truth isn't important. Obviously it is. Yeah. But I think you often start where people are and you help them to see that actually, those deep longings that you have, that sense of that your life doesn't feel fulfilled. Maybe there is something that Christianity can offer. And maybe along the way, you'll find that there's also something very tangible and true about it as well. It's not just a sort of, so I do think that's where you should probably be starting. And I think the example you give is exactly right. What I'm encountering is that there's a great openness among young people to the supernatural. It can come in all kinds of shapes and forms. You know, you look on TikTok, you've got people manifesting and doing witch talk and all kinds of stuff. For me, I see that as a potentially really interesting, fertile, open ground, actually. And some extraordinary conversations I've been having really in the last year or so with people very much working alongside student populations. Here in the UK, for instance, a student worker who works for a kind of campus ministry said that they did a survey among non-Christians, and 75% of respondents said they would say yes if someone asked them to church. They've never seen a kind of response like that in the UK before in all of their time doing ministry. So there's a kind of an openness, interestingly, there. It's obviously being channeled in lots of esoteric directions, but actually I think in a funny way, because especially here in the UK, young people don't have any Christian history. They've never been to church by and large. They also don't have any baggage around it. Not quite so true in the USA, I have a feeling, but here in the UK, it's like there's a bit of a blank slate, and it's opening up some interesting opportunities.
Yeah, it's definitely different here, but I do encounter lots of like I said, Duke undergrads who their parents were the deconstructing ones. Their parents were the critical of church ones. And so there's a weird, almost like teenage rebellion into like going across the street to the Presbyterian church. And like there's a weird dynamic that can happen that's interesting and really cool too. Okay, Justin, our last question we always ask. Imagine that you are, as you mentioned earlier, you're at church. A small child, we could hear from this voice pretty young, asks, how do we know God is real? What would your kind of short kid answer to them be?
I would say, well, how do you know that the air is real? Because you can't see it. You know, I could say, well, it's probably not there because you can't see it. But actually, we do know the air is real because sometimes I can see the way it's moving the leaves on the trees. So I can see that that the air is there. I just can't see it right now. And actually, the way I most of all know the air is real is because I'm breathing it right now. It's keeping me alive. And I think God is a bit like that. We can't see God, and that's often the problem. We want to be able to see that God is real in the way I can see you looking at you right now. But some of the most important things that we believe in, we can't see in that kind of way, but we can sense that they're there. We can see evidence for them in other ways, like the air, the wind moving the trees. And because ultimately they make sense of us, just like I wouldn't be here if it wasn't for the air that I'm breathing. So I think God is kind of like the air we breathe, all around us. Yes, we can't see him, but actually absolutely essential for everything that we do. And we often see God in all kinds of other ways that don't always involve a strictly logical scientific explanation.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Thank you, Justin, so much for your time today and for taking this question really seriously with me.
Oh, bless you. Lovely to be on the show. Thank you, Kaitlyn.
There's something Justin said at the beginning of our conversation that is important to go back to. He said that we can know lots of things that we cannot prove. As he explained, there are good rational reasons to believe in the existence of God, even in the existence of the God of the Bible. But just like we can know something without being able to prove it, we can prove things we do not truly know. If you have, like this small child, wondered, but how do I know God is real? Perhaps you'd need to spend some time studying the arguments that remove roadblocks, like Justin described. There are really good arguments, good answers to lots of our hard questions. But at the end of the day, most of us are looking for an experience of knowing that cannot be manufactured or forced. We want the calm, settled knowledge that God is real, instead of the anxiety we may feel about proving that God is real. And we only get that peace from the one who is our peace, the one who preached peace to those of us who were far away and peace to those who were near, who gives us access to the Father by the Spirit. And the good news is that we can ask him for that peace. He has made himself accessible to us. As we study arguments for God, as we think well about how to make a persuasive case for Christianity in our ever-changing culture, let's not forget to simply ask God for the faith we desire, for ourselves and for others we love.
Curiously Kaitlyn is a production of Holy Post Media. Produced by Mike Stralo. Editing by Seth Gorvet. Theme song by Phil Vischer. Be sure to follow us on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts, and leave a review so more people can discover thoughtful Christian commentary, plus cute kids, and never any butt news.